Wednesday, September 6th, 2023, AGNDD Intellireport topic. List of cognitive biases. Please pardon any visual and informational inaccuracies in this entirely AI-generated Wikipedia-sourced video article.
Introduction. Biases have a significant impact on human behavior, influencing belief formation, reasoning processes, and decision-making. The anchoring bias, which involves relying too heavily on one piece of information, can lead to distorted judgments. It is important to be aware of biases and consider alternative approaches in order to avoid making biased decisions. Biases have a significant impact on various aspects of human behavior, including belief formation, reasoning processes, business and economic decisions. These biases can influence how individuals perceive and interpret information, leading to distorted judgments and decision-making. It is important to be aware of these biases in order to mitigate their effects and make more rational and informed choices. The anchoring bias refers to the tendency to rely too heavily on one piece of information when making decisions. This bias can manifest in various ways, such as combining studies from the same source, being resistant to revising beliefs, being limited by traditional uses of objects, or over-relying on familiar tools or methods. It is important to be aware of this bias and consider alternative approaches to avoid making biased decisions. Apophenia refers to the tendency to perceive meaningful connections or patterns between unrelated things. It includes the clustering illusion, where people overestimate the importance of small patterns in random data, illusory correlation, where individuals inaccurately perceive a relationship between unrelated events, and pareidolia, where vague stimuli are perceived as significant, such as seeing images or faces in clouds or hearing hidden messages in reversed audio recordings. The availability heuristic is a cognitive bias where people overestimate the likelihood of events based on how easily they can recall similar events from memory. This bias can be influenced by recent or emotionally charged memories. It also includes other biases such as anthropocentric thinking, anthropomorphism, attentional bias, frequency illusion, implicit association, salience bias, selection bias, survivorship bias, and the well-traveled road effect. The normalcy bias is the refusal to plan for or react to a new disaster. Effort justification is when people value outcomes more if they put effort into achieving them, like the IKEA effect. The Ben Franklin effect states that people who do favors for others are more likely to do more favors for them in the future. Confirmation bias is the tendency to seek out and interpret information in a way that confirms one's existing beliefs. It is one of several cognitive biases related to confirmation bias, including the backfire effect, congruence bias, experimenter's bias, observer expectancy effect, selective perception, and the Semmelweis reflex. These biases can lead individuals to ignore or dismiss evidence that contradicts their beliefs and reinforce their preconceived notions. Egocentric bias is the tendency to heavily rely on one's own perspective and perceive oneself differently from others. It appears in different forms, including bias blind spot, false consensus effect, false uniqueness bias, Forer effect, illusion of asymmetric insight, illusion of control, illusion of transparency, illusion of validity, illusory superiority, naive cynicism, naive realism, overconfidence effect, planning fallacy, restraint bias, trait ascription bias, and third-person effect. These biases can result in inaccurate judgments and perceptions of oneself and others. Extension neglect refers to the tendency to overlook or underestimate certain factors or aspects when making decisions or judgments. It includes various cognitive biases such as base rate neglect, compassion fade, conjunction fallacy, duration neglect, hyperbolic discounting, insensitivity to sample size, less is better effect, neglect of probability, scope neglect, and zero risk bias. These biases can lead to irrational decision-making and a failure to consider important information or factors. False priors are initial beliefs and knowledge that can lead to biased evaluations of evidence. Some examples of biases based on false priors include agent detection bias, automation bias, gender bias, sexual overperception bias, sexual underperception bias, and stereotyping. These biases can result in incorrect conclusions and discriminatory behavior. The framing effect refers to the tendency to make different decisions based on how information is presented. This can include the contrast effect, where perception of a stimulus is influenced by a contrasting object, the decoy effect, where preferences change when a third option is introduced, the default effect, where the default option is favored, the denomination effect, where spending is influenced by the form of currency, the distinction bias, where options appear more dissimilar when evaluated together, and the domain neglect bias, where relevant knowledge is ignored in problem solving. Bergson's paradox is the misinterpretation of statistical experiments involving conditional probabilities. Escalation of commitment is the irrational tendency to justify increased investment in a decision based on prior investment, despite new evidence suggesting it was wrong. The G.I. Joe fallacy is the belief that knowing about cognitive bias is enough to overcome it. Gambler's fallacy is the mistaken belief that future probabilities are influenced by past events. The hot hand fallacy is the belief that past success increases the likelihood of future success. Plan continuation bias is the failure to recognize when a plan is no longer appropriate. Subadditivity effect is the tendency to underestimate the probability of a whole compared to its parts. Time-saving bias is the underestimation or overestimation of time saved or lost when changing speeds. Zero-sum bias is the incorrect perception of a situation as a zero-sum game. Prospect theory is a psychological theory that explains how people make decisions under uncertainty. It includes several related concepts such as the ambiguity effect, disposition effect, dread aversion, endowment effect, loss aversion, pseudo-certainty effect, status quo bias, and system justification. These concepts describe various biases and tendencies that influence decision-making, such as avoiding unknown probabilities, selling assets that have gained value, and defending the status quo. The Dunning-Kruger effect refers to unskilled individuals overestimating their abilities, while experts underestimate their abilities. The hot-cold empathy gap is the tendency to underestimate the influence of visceral drives on attitudes and behaviors. The hard-easy effect involves overestimating ability for difficult tasks and underestimating ability for easy tasks. The illusion of explanatory depth is the belief of understanding a topic better than one actually does. Imposter syndrome is the fear of being exposed as a fraud despite accomplishments. The objectivity illusion is the belief of being more objective than others, often without recognizing it in oneself. Belief bias is when someone's judgment of an argument's logical strength is influenced by how believable the conclusion is. The illusory truth effect is the tendency to believe a statement is true if it is easy to process or has been repeated, regardless of its actual truth. The rhyme as reason effect refers to the perception that rhyming statements are more truthful. Subjective validation occurs when statements are seen as true based on a person's belief or when coincidences are connected based on personal bias. Association fallacies are cognitive biases that involve making incorrect assumptions based on associations or correlations. Some examples include authority bias, where people give more weight to the opinion of an authority figure regardless of its content, the cheerleader effect, where individuals appear more attractive in a group than alone, and the halo effect, where positive or negative traits of a person spill over into other areas of perception. Attribution bias refers to the tendency for individuals to make biased judgments about the causes of behavior. Some common types of attribution bias include the actor-observer bias, defensive attribution hypothesis, extrinsic incentives bias, fundamental attribution error, group attribution error, hostile attribution bias, intentionality bias, just world hypothesis, moral luck, puritanical bias, self-serving bias, and ultimate attribution error. These biases can lead to inaccurate assessments of others' behavior and can influence how individuals perceive and interpret events. Conformity is involved in various psychological phenomena such as availability cascade, bandwagon effect, courtesy bias, groupthink, group shift, social desirability bias, and truth bias. These phenomena involve individuals conforming to the beliefs, opinions, or behaviors of others in order to fit in, avoid conflict, or adhere to social norms. Conformity can influence decision-making, perception of truth, and the formation of collective beliefs. In-group bias refers to the tendency for people to favor individuals who belong to their own group. This bias is related to the aversion to using or accepting ideas, products, or knowledge from outside the group, known as not invented here syndrome. It is also connected to the perception that members of other groups are more similar to each other compared to members of one's own group, known as outgroup homogeneity bias. In psychology and cognitive science, memory bias refers to cognitive biases that affect the recall of memories. These biases can either enhance or impair memory recall, affect the time it takes to recall a memory, or alter the content of a reported memory. There are various types of memory biases that can influence our memory processes. Misattributions can occur due to cryptomnesia, false memory, social cryptomnesia, source confusion, suggestibility, and the Perky effect. Cryptomnesia involves mistaking a memory for a new thought, while false memory occurs when imagination is mistaken for a memory. Social cryptomnesia refers to the failure to remember the origin of a societal change. Source confusion leads to distorted memories, while suggestibility involves mistaking ideas suggested by others for memories. The Perky effect involves the misremembering of real images as imagined. In conclusion, biases play a significant role in human behavior and decision-making. Being aware of these biases, such as the anchoring bias, can help us make more rational and informed choices.
Thank you for watching this AGND Intellireport. Like, subscribe, and click the bell button to get notified during new uploads. And make sure to tune in next time. Stay safe and healthy. Cheers.